When the last Ottonian, Henry II, died in July of 1024, the German nobility was faced with a problem. Henry had been childless, and as such, left no heir to replace him. So in that same year, the feudal lords of the empire met near the modern-day city of Oppenheim to determine who among them would become emperor. For the most part, they all agreed that they wanted the crown to remain in the ruling family, and it very quickly became clear that there were really only two candidates for the job. Two men, both named Conrad. Now, both Conrads were descended from Otto the Great by a female branch, and they both seemed decent enough candidates. Going into the election, the younger Conrad seemed to have the advantage, as he held more land and had more money. However, the majority of the electors present seemed to prefer the elder Conrad. Perhaps to save face, or perhaps to get in good graces with the future king, Conrad the younger acquiesced to his older cousin, and in short order, the elder was given the German crown. Now officially known as Conrad II, this new German king would become the founder of what we today call the Salian Dynasty. Conrad was 34 at the time of his election, and he was a serious, grounded man who took on any issue with a sense of utmost importance. Having not been a landed noble, that is, just being some guy among many other royal family members who didn't hold land, Conrad had managed to grow up beneath the petty squabbles of the Ottonian nobility. Despite his inauspicious start to life, Conrad would go on to become the archetypal ideal of a Salian ruler for most of his reign. Stern, serious, and right at home chipping away at the duties of kingship. Not long after his crowning, Conrad would get started on those duties by doing what had become customary for newly elected German kings, going on a grand tour of the kingdom. Now, upon becoming king, Conrad had inherited a larger domain than any of his predecessors. This meant that not only did he have more responsibilities in terms of the sheer geographical size of the empire, but also that he needed more bureaucratic busybodies to help out with the day-to-day administration of the new lands. As such, there was a new influx of landed nobility all vying for influence on the crown. With these demands piling on him, Conrad soon figured out that he would have to exert as much control over his subjects as possible, while making it more and more difficult for them to disobey their ruler. This for Conrad took the form of constantly traveling to various parts of the empire to personally visit potential hotspots of rebellion, as well as holding on to as much land for himself as he could. After his nomination as king, Conrad departed for Aachen, the legendary capital of Charlemagne. On his way, he was supposedly stopped by three of his subjects, who each had complaints for the king. Though Conrad's advisors told him he didn't have to listen to the complaints of some random, annoying peasants, Conrad insisted on hearing each case and administering justice to each person. Though this story is likely apocryphal, it gives good insights into what exactly the medieval person would have expected from their rulers, namely justice and the fair administration of the law. This theme probably best defines Conrad, and the sources spend a fair amount of time going out of their way to paint him as the lawgiver. After making his way through Saxony, and eventually through the rest of Germany, the new king prepared himself for his inevitable march south through the Alps to be crowned emperor in Rome. Before he left, he named his son Henry as heir, and prepared for the long march with an army at his back. On his way to Italy, Conrad stopped in the kingdom of Burgundy, as there was a chance he could fold that kingdom into his empire if he played his diplomatic cards right. The current king of Burgundy, named Rudolf, was a weak ruler who had promised Conrad's predecessor, Henry II, that the kingdom of Burgundy would pass to Henry upon Rudolf's death. However, Henry wound up dying first, and so Rudolf was determined to renege on his end of the bargain since, the guy he made the bargain with in the first place is now dead. Conrad, pressing the matter, was able to reconvince Rudolf to allow his crown to pass to the German king upon his death, and a temporary peace was made between the two. This guarantee from Rudolf would not be enough, however, and Conrad would eventually have to invade the kingdom to place it firmly under his control. After securing Burgundy, he crossed into Italy. Soon after, Conrad entered into a dispute with the local elites in the city of Pavia. Some of these local lords had destroyed a building which belonged to Henry II immediately after his death. Conrad claimed that just as the empire had passed from Henry to himself, So did all of the emperor's property, and as such, the Pavians had no right to tear down the building. Perhaps amazed at the pettiness of the whole thing, the Pavians refused to rebuild the property, and a siege of the city soon commenced, which would continue for another 2 years. At the same time, riots broke out in the city of Ravenna, during which Conrad himself had to stop his troops from terrorizing the locals. It turns out there was a bit of a learning curve to this whole being a Roman emperor thing. After putting down these 2 riots, as well as an additional rebellion in the city of Lucca, King Conrad entered into Rome in the year 1027. There he was crowned emperor by Pope John XIX, in the presence of King Rudolf and King Canute of Denmark, England, and Norway. Back in Germany, however, things had taken a rebellious turn for the worse. Ernst, Duke of Alemannia and stepson to the now Emperor Conrad, along with a group of conspirators, rose up against their liege lord. Seeing their opportunity, the rebels soon invaded Burgundy. Not wanting to tick off his new buddy Conrad, Rudolf did the sensible thing and refused to help out the rebels, and actually managed to hold them off long enough for Conrad to get back from Italy. Soon thereafter, the emperor returned, and both sides agreed to a meeting to discuss their terms. Feeling pretty confident going in, Ernst wanted to push his luck in these negotiations. But that luck would soon run out. The emperor had promised Ernst's co-conspirators lands, money, and the privilege of not having their heads separated from their bodies, and this was an offer too good to pass up. Alone and isolated diplomatically, Ernst threw himself on the mercy of the emperor, and Conrad spared his life, banishing him to exile in Saxony. With these matters settled, Conrad was now the undisputed master of the Holy Roman Empire. This peace would not last long, as the emperor soon took up arms against the Hungarians in a largely unsuccessful campaign, as well as fighting pagans to the north and his rebellious Italian nobles to the south throughout his entire reign. He would die in 1039, passing on the entire empire peacefully to his son, Henry III. Conrad is often said to have ruled the empire at the zenith of its power and prestige, but this shouldn't be taken to mean that this power and prestige were necessarily due to anything that Conrad did himself. The empire's dominance in Europe during these years was mostly due to the fact that the French monarchy, so often a counterweight to the empire during later years, was not yet the stable, centralized power it would go on to become, and the rest of Europe was simply too fractured to put up any meaningful resistance. Up to this point, the papacy had also been a rubber stamp for the emperors, and it was essentially only kept around to give the newly anointed German kings some sense of higher legitimacy that they couldn't claim for themselves. But this trend would not continue, as drastic change was coming to the church in the years of the Salians, and by the time Conrad's son had died and passed on the crown to his son Henry IV, the papacy would feel confident enough to flex its muscle as not only a religious power, but a temporal one as well. After the death of Conrad, the rumblings of a reformist movement within the Catholic Church began to make themselves felt throughout Europe. The Church had fallen into a state of corruption and decadence, they said, with bishops openly exchanging money with their local liege lord for appointment to ecclesiastical office, or, as it is referred to in the sources, the practice of simony. As if this wasn't bad enough, these reformers began to take a look around and realize that, hey, wait a minute, some of these guys who swore to live a life of denial and chastity are, not doing that. Upset with the order of things, these reformers broadly wanted the religious nobility to adhere more strictly to the teachings and lifestyle of Christ, and in addition wanted rulers to stop taking bribes for offices. In addition to this, the Reform movement wanted the Church, as a political institution, to exert more power and authority over the secular rulers of Europe. For too long, they said, God's representatives on earth had been little more than pawns in a larger political game played by the lay nobility. To understand this great crisis, we have to explain a little bit about what lay investiture is. Generally speaking, throughout Europe, rulers could expect to appoint religious nobles to run bishoprics as they, the rulers, saw fit. This practice of investing someone with a title and lands is known as investiture. So when we say lay investiture, lay simply refers to secular, non-church rulers like kings. Therefore, lay investiture is when secular rulers appoint their own land-holding church vassals. Got all that? Good. This new reformist movement challenged the notion that secular leaders should be appointing spiritual vassals, saying that ecclesiastical leaders should be appointed either by the Pope or from within the Church, thus keeping the office in the hands of God's representatives. This conflict would go on to become the famous investiture controversy, which would prove to be a turning point in the histories of both the Church and the Holy Roman Empire. The ball really got rolling on the investiture controversy when one of these reformist clerics named Ildebrando di Soana got himself elected pope in 1073, during the reign of Conrad II's grandson, Henry IV. Legend has it that Ildebrando, called Gregory VII as pope, was chosen to be the Holy Father while he was attending the previous pope's funeral. Supposedly, members of the clergy began proclaiming Ildebrando pope with loud shouts and fervent prayers. This gave him the opportunity to show humility in refusing the papacy until a legitimate papal election could be held. Though more than likely engineered beforehand, the acclamations of Gregory's peers to usher in his reign as pope would also usher in a new era for the papacy. From now on, the popes would seek to use their power for more than just sticking a crown on the heads of the German kings. More than anything, the investiture conflict can be seen as the inevitable moment of collision between temporal and spiritual authority that had been destined to happen ever since the days of Charlemagne. Who really gave the emperor his power? Did the emperor win the crown on the merits of his own accomplishments, with the pope merely making the whole thing official? Or was the pope a crucial part of the whole process, without whom God's blessing could not make the emperor officially the emperor? After most of Western Europe had been Christianized, it definitely seems to the dispassionate observer that the emperors needed the popes a lot more than the popes needed the emperors. This realization eventually dawned on our new friend Pope Gregory, and eventually he would find a way to use this to his advantage. Though Gregory's reign as pope had started off with great fanfare, Henry IV's reign as king and emperor were tumultuous from the start. Henry, not yet 6 at the time of his accession to the throne, had received an empire beginning to show signs of weakness. Though his father had been a strong ruler, he had left the boy king a litany of disasters in waiting with which to deal. The German nobility had always been a fickle, rebellious bunch. The Italians had always chafed to some extent under the rule of the Germanic Empire. The Normans, a rising power across Europe, had made a name for their dynasty, and some of its members began to convince the Pope that perhaps they, rather than the Germans, could be the protector of the papacy. And of course, with the specter of church reform threatening the ability of the emperors to appoint their own bishops, the risks for the empire were very real and very threatening. And into this chaotic, restless time came a 6-year-old king whose mother did all the actual governing for him. Despite his mother's best efforts, ambitious nobles began plotting to exert influence over their young king from very early on. This culminated in young Henry being captured and taken aboard a boat sailing for Cologne by the Archbishop Anno and a few others. Henry, displaying a persistence that would come to characterize his later life, attempted to escape his captors by jumping overboard, nearly drowning in the process. But nevertheless, he was dragged back onto the boat, and within the year, the Queen Mother Agnes had lost all influence over her son, and all influence over the empire. As Henry grew up, he became more and more determined to right the wrongs of his childhood and, following the leads of his predecessors, got wise to the game of leaning on his clerical vassals for support against the traditional landed nobility. This strategy, as Henry soon realized, would be threatened by a church reform movement that desperately wanted to take that crucial leg of support away from the emperors. This meant that by definition, Henry had to be opposed to the movement, or else he would have no base of support. Early on in his adult years, Henry showed great energy in putting out the metaphorical fires of rebellion cropping up around Germany. This was made all the more impressive by the fact that Henry really didn't have any sort of formal royal training as a child.